In this video, we're gonna talk about nervous system in general, then describe and compare somatic and autonomic nervous system. Subsequently, we're gonna use an illustration to see how the somatic and autonomic nervous systems are coordinated in response to stimuli. We're gonna compare various features of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems as well. Ultimately, we're gonna cover ganglia, talk about their types and locations. Nervous system is highly complex part of an animal that coordinates its actions and sensory information by transmitting to and from different parts of its body. The nervous system detects environmental changes that impact the body, then works in tandem with endocrine system to respond to such events. In vertebrates, the nervous system consists of two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of brain and spinal cord, and it is the main integrative and control center in the body. Peripheral nervous system consists of mainly nerves, which are the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, ganglia, receptors. The nerves connect the central nervous system to every other part of the body. Nerves that transmit signals from the brain are called motor or efferent nerves, while those nerves that transmit information from the body to the central nervous system are called sensory or afferent nerves. The peripheral nervous system is divided into three separate subsystems: the somatic, autonomic, and enteric nervous system. The enteric is not shown on this picture. Somatic nerves mediate voluntary movement. The autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is activated in cases of emergencies to mobilize energy, while the parasympathetic nerves is activated when organisms in a relaxed state. The enteric nervous system functions to control gastrointestinal system. Both autonomic and enteric nervous systems function involuntarily. Nerves that exit from the cranium, mainly from the brain stem, are called cranial nerves, while those exiting throughout the spinal cord are called the spinal nerves. Somatic motor nerves lead the muscles that are controlled by conscious control. So the somatic nervous system innervates the muscles of the body, striated muscles, muscles of upper extremities, lower extremities, and body, and also innervates the skin and receive GSA information, general somatic afferent information, from the skin and the muscles, striated muscles. By contrast, autonomic motor nerves or the autonomic nervous system innervates the organs without conscious control. In other words, autonomic nervous system innervates the structures that contain smooth muscle, mainly the organs, glands, vessels. Now let's compare the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now note that In somatic nervous system, there are two neurons. These are the upper motor neuron, and the lower motor neuron. In the autonomic nervous system, there is a pre-ganglionic neuron and a post-ganglionic neuron. Now let's continue with the upper and lower motor neurons of the somatic nervous system. Cell bodies of the upper motor neuron are found mainly in the cerebral cortex, superior colliculus, red nucleus, formatio reticularis, or the reticular formation of the brain stem, and vestibular complex. In other words, these sending pathways are the upper motor neurons, and they stimulate the lower motor neurons. Now, the lower motor neurons in the body are found in two different places. One is the cranial motor nuclei in the brain stem. So the axons of the cranial motor nuclei actually form the lower motor neurons, which are, in this case, the cranial nerves. And there are also lower motor neurons in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, whose axons come together and form the spinal nerves. So the lower motor neurons receive cortical and subcortical innervations from the brain through the upper motor neurons. For the autonomic nervous system, in the brain stem and throughout the spinal cord, there are autonomic centers. Those autonomic centers are stimulated by the hypothalamus. In other words, hypothalamus controls the work of the speed of our autonomic nervous system through the connection between the hypothalamus and the autonomic centers inside the brain stem and inside the mainly lateral horn of the spinal cord. And there are pre-ganglionic visceral motor neurons, and there are also post-ganglionic visceral motor neurons. So these are unique to the autonomic nervous system. In the autonomic nervous system, there are pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic neurons. By contrast, in the somatic nervous system, there are upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons. Now here we see the somatic motor neuron. This is a lower motor neuron whose cell body stays in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and it leaves the spinal cord through the ventral root and then enters the spinal nerve and innervates its effector without any interruption. By contrast, autonomic motor neuron, which is also known as visceral motor neuron, whose cell bodies reside in the lateral horn of the spinal cord and in the parasympathetic nuclei of the brain stem. Their axons synapse in a ganglion, and then the post-ganglionic neuron stimulates its effector. Okay, now using this picture, let's see how our autonomic and the somatic nervous systems are integrated during our daily life. In the picture, a man receives stimuli, and those stimuli are conducted through the sensory division of the nervous system, and the action potentials reach to the brain, the central nervous system, the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex or the brain process and integrate information, then initiate responses and also the mental activity. Through these responses and mental activity or the efferent outputs, the motor division of the autonomic and somatic nervous systems are activated. Activation of the somatic nervous system activates the skeletal muscles. Through activation of the skeletal muscles, we can run away or fight back. But meantime, our autonomic nervous system activates the smooth muscles in the heart, in the lungs, and in the wall of the vessels. This is how we can respond to a stimuli during our daily activities. Now, the autonomic nervous system, we talked about the somatic and autonomic nervous system, and we compared them to somehow. Now, let's talk about the autonomic nervous system itself. The autonomic nervous system is part of the nervous system that supplies the internal organs, including the blood vessels, stomach, liver, intestines, genitals, kidneys, pupils, and glands, the intestinal glands, respiratory glands, salivatory glands. All those structures contain smooth muscles in their structure, in their body, and they are all innervated by the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has two main divisions: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. After the autonomic nervous system receives information about the body and external environment, it responds by stimulating body processes, usually through the sympathetic division, or inhibiting them, usually through the parasympathetic division. An autonomic nerve pathway involves two nerve cells. One is here, we're gonna call this pre-ganglionic. The other one is here, we're gonna call this post-ganglionic. So an autonomic nerve pathway, again, involves two nerve cells. One cell is located in the brainstem, or in the spinal cord. It is connected by nerve fiber to the other cell, which is located in a cluster of nerve cells called an autonomic ganglion or the motor ganglion. Nerve fibers from this ganglia connect with internal organs. Most of the ganglia for the sympathetic nervous system are located just outside the spinal cord. These are the paravertebral ganglia. And also there are ganglia located in front of the abdominal aorta around its main branches. These are the collateral or the pre-aortic ganglia. These are all sympathetic ganglia. And the ganglia for the parasympathetic nervous system are located near or in the organs they connect with. Now let's review very briefly the autonomic centers for the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, in the autonomic nervous system, there are two neurons in order. One is the pre-ganglionic neuron, its cell body, always located in the central nervous system, in the brain stem and in the spinal cord. And there are ganglia, which are sympathetic or parasympathetic ganglia. Inside the ganglia, there are the post-ganglionic neurons. Now, the cell bodies of the preganglionic sympathetics reside in the lateral horn of the spinal cord between T1 and T2 spinal segments. But remember, there is a small contribution from the C8 spinal segment and also a partial contribution from the T3, the L2 spinal segment. This should be the L2. And for the parasympathetics, cell bodies of the parasympathetics, preganglionic cell bodies of the parasympathetics are found in the brain stem, mainly in the cranial parasympathetic nuclei. These are the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerves. And also the lateral horn of the spinal segments S2 through S4. And this autonomic centers are innervated, are controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay, now let's compare different features of the somatic, parasympathetic, and sympathetic nerves. In the somatic nervous system, there are the somatic nerves. Somatic nerves in this table are the lower motor neurons. Their cell bodies located in the cranial motor nuclei in the brain stem for the cranial nerves, or in the anterior horn of the spinal cord for the spinal nerves. And processes of the, or axons of the somatic motor nerves are heavily myelinated. Cell bodies for the sympathetics, preganglionic cell bodies for the sympathetics are located in the lateral horn of the spinal cord between T1 and L2 segments. And cell bodies for the parasympathetics are located in the parasympathetic nuclei of the cranial nerves in the brain stem, which are the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and the vagal nerves. And also in the lateral horn of the spinal cord between S2 and S4 spinal segments. Preganglionic sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves are lightly myelinated. By contrast, post-ganglionic, sympathetic, and parasympathetics are not myelinated, so they are unmyelinated. Since somatic motor neurons are heavily myelinated, their conduction is really fast. By contrast, since the pre-ganglionic autonomics are lightly myelinated and their post-ganglionics are not myelinated or unmyelinated, the conduction through the autonomic motor neurons is slower. Now let's look at the neurotransmitter that somatic and autonomic motor neurons use. Now, somatic motor neurons, pre-ganglionic sympathetic, parasympathetic, post-ganglionic parasympathetics all release acetylcholine. But the post-ganglionic sympathetics mostly, in most cases, release norepinephrine. There is an exception to this one. We're gonna talk about it as well. Now let's look at the effector organs or targets of the somatic motor neuron and the autonomic motor neuron. Somatic motor neurons innervate the skeletal muscles, and its activation is always stimulatory. By contrast, the effector organs for the autonomic nervous system is the smooth muscles. So any structure that contains smooth muscles are innervated by the autonomic nervous system. And these are the internal organs, glands, and the vessels. So when the autonomic nervous system is activated, its effect is either stimulatory or inhibitory, depending on neurotransmitter and receptors on effector organs. Okay, let's review what we have seen in terms of the transmitter, the somatic and autonomic motor neurons release. So again, somatic motor neurons, pre-ganglionic, parasympathetic, and sympathetic, post-ganglionic parasympathetics, they all release acetylcholine. But post-ganglionic sympathetics release norepinephrine or noradrenaline, epinephrine, and adrenaline. But there is an exception to this rule. Post-ganglionic sympathetics innervating the eccrine sweat glands, they also release acetylcholine. Okay, now let's look at, we have discussed the effectors of the somatics, and now we know that effectors of the somatic motor neurons are the skeletal muscles, or the striated muscles, or the body muscles. Whatever you hear, you know that skeletal muscles, body muscles, or striated muscles, they are innervated by the somatic motor neurons, whose cell bodies are located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord for the spinal nerves, in the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves, in the brainstem for the cranial nerves. For the autonomic nervous system, the targets are the smooth muscles, mainly the cardiac muscles, glands, and the internal organs. Now let's look at the efferent pathways for the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. For the somatic nervous system, there are no ganglia, and the somatic motor neurons are heavily myelinated, and they extend from ventral horn of the spinal cord to their effectors. For the spinal nerves, from motor nuclei of the brainstem to the effectors for the cranial nerves. For the autonomic nervous system, there are two neuron pathways. First is pre-ganglionic, and its body resides in the brainstem, and also for the brainstem for the parasympathetics. And in the spinal cord, lateral horn of the spinal cord, for both sympathetic and parasympathetics. Post-ganglionic neuron and its body resides in autonomic ganglion. So this is the post-ganglionic neuron, this is the pre-ganglionic neuron, here is the ganglion. Now inside the ganglion, pre-ganglionic neuron synapses with post-ganglionic neuron. Note that there is no physical contact between the pre-ganglionic and the post-ganglionic neurons inside the ganglion. Okay, in the sympathetic nervous system, there are short pre-ganglionic and long post-ganglionic axons. In the parasympathetic nervous system, there are long pre-ganglionic and short post-ganglionic axons. Okay, now here we see the somatic motor neuron innervating its effector, and here is the visceral motor neuron or autonomic motor neuron synapsing in a ganglion. So this is the pre-ganglionic axon, whose cell bodies are found in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. If this is sympathetic, between T1 and L2 spinal segments, and if this is at the level between the S2 and S4 spinal segments, this is the pre-ganglionic parasympathetics. Here is the ganglion. Inside the ganglion, there is the ganglionic neuron cell body, and post-ganglionic visceral motor neuron innervates its target or effector, that is the smooth muscle, glands in visceral organs, or the smooth muscles in the wall of the vessels. Now, as you see here, the somatic motor neurons are heavily myelinated, so the conduction of impulses is very fast. By contrast, while pre-ganglionic neurons are lightly myelinated, post-ganglionics are not myelinated at all. So the conduction of impulses in the autonomic nervous system is much slower compared to the somatic nervous system. Now, when our sympathetic nervous system is stimulated, it leads to a very diffused effect. By contrast, when the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, it leads to a more localized or focused effect. This is explained by the difference in branching of axons in the sympathetic nervous system and in the parasympathetic nervous system. As you see in this drawing, sympathetic axons are highly branched to influence many organs, while parasympathetic axons have few branches, so have a localized or focal effect. As you see, both pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic sympathetics heavily branch. So when sympathetic nervous system is active, it generates a diffused effect throughout our body. While we are exposed to a fear or intense sympathetic stimuli, we are petrified. But when we see a food, or we smell it, or we taste it, it just increases salivary secretion, maybe gastrointestinal movements, but that's it. Now let's talk about another element of the peripheral nervous system, the ganglion. This ganglion is a group of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. They are often interconnected with other ganglia to form a complex system of ganglia known as plexus. Moreover, ganglia provide relay points and intermediary connections between different neurological structures in the body, such as peripheral and central nervous systems. There are mainly two types of ganglia. These are sensory ganglia and motor ganglia. For the somatic motor neurons or somatic nervous system, there are no ganglia because somatic motor neurons do not synapse. So the motor ganglia are basically autonomic ganglia, autonomic motor, visceral motor ganglia. The sensory ganglia contain either pseudo-unipolar neuron or bipolar neuron. If a ganglion is about general sensation, general somatic afferent or general visceral afferent, this ganglion contains pseudo-unipolar neuron. If a ganglion is about special sensation like olfaction, taste, balance, it contains bipolar neuron. So in the body, there are several sensory ganglia. In the sensory ganglia, there are the cell bodies of the sensory neurons and no nerves synapse in the sensory ganglia. Now, there are the spinal ganglia. Look at this is the spinal ganglion. Here is the spinal ganglion. Now, spinal ganglia are present throughout the spinal cord, and sensory nerve fibers inside the spinal nerve inside the spinal nerves. Their cell bodies are located in this ganglion. And this spinal ganglion is for spinal nerves. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and also we have 31 pairs of spinal ganglia as well. So for each spinal nerve, there is a spinal ganglion. Similar to our spinal nerves, certain cranial nerves also have sensory ganglion. The fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve, has trigeminal ganglion, which is here. Our seventh cranial nerve, the facial nerve, has the gingulate ganglion. And our eighth cranial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, has two ganglia. Those are the spiral or the cochlear ganglion, which is about audition, and the vestibular or the Scarpa's ganglion, which is about balance, the equilibrium. The glossopharyngeal and the vagal nerve also have sensory ganglia. The glossopharyngeal nerve has superior or the jugular, inferior or the petrosal ganglia. And the vagus nerve has superior or rostral and inferior or the nodus ganglia. These are the sensory ganglia for spinal nerves and the cranial nerves. Inside the sensory ganglia, there are the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Again, in the sensory ganglia, we have either pseudo-unipolar neuron, which receives GSA or GVA sensation, or there are bipolar neurons which receive and detect special sensation, the SVA or SSA, special somatic sensory, or the special visceral sensory, or the special visceral afferent, the olfaction, taste, balance, vision. Now, for the motor ganglia, we have two types of motor ganglia. We have sympathetic ganglia and the parasympathetic ganglia. Sympathetic ganglia are classified in two groups based on their location. There are the paravertebral ganglia, which are also called the ganglia of sympathetic trunk or the sympathetic chain. We're gonna look at this paravertebral ganglia shortly in detail. And there are also prevertebral ganglia. These are the collateral ganglia or the pre-aortic ganglia. And we're gonna also look at this ganglia in detail. We have parasympathetic ganglia as well. While few of the parasympathetic ganglia are named, as you see here, the ciliary ganglion, pterygopalatine ganglion, submandibular ganglion, otic ganglion, these are the named parasympathetic ganglia. But most of the parasympathetic ganglia are not named, they are unnamed, but they are still known as terminal ganglion and the intramural ganglion. We're gonna also talk about this ganglia as well. Now, Here you see this sympathetic chain or the sympathetic trunk. The paravertebral ganglia form the sympathetic trunk or sympathetic chain, which extends from neck down to the pelvis. Typically, there are 23 ganglia. At the beginning of the embryonic life, the number of spinal segments equal to the number of paravertebral ganglia. But as we grow older, the cervical ganglia unite and become 3. So in the cervical region, there are three paravertebral ganglia. In the thoracic region, 11, lumbar region, 4, sacral region, 4, and the coccygeal region, 1 paravertebral ganglia are present. Fibers enter chain from ventral root via white ramus communicandus, which are myelinated fibers, and found only in T1, L2 spinal segments. But the post-ganglionics exit ganglia via ramus communicandus, which are unmyelinated because these are the post-ganglionic visceral motor neurons, and they are found along entire length of chain, allowing sympathetic output to reach all areas of the body. Now, the paravertebral ganglia are found along the length of the sympathetic chain, and they are also known as the ganglia of sympathetic chain or the trunk. And these ganglia are distinguished as cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And except in the neck, they are closely correspond in number to the vertebrae. But in the cervical region, the cervical ganglia unite and become 3. And we name the cervical ganglia as the superior cervical ganglion, middle cervical ganglion, and the inferior cervical ganglion. But the thoracic ganglia, lumbar ganglia, and sacral ganglia are not specifically named. They are just known as thoracic, which are 12, lumbar, which are 4, and the sacral, which are 4 again in numbers. Now, there are also ganglia located in front of the aorta, specifically around the stem of the unpaired branches of the aorta. These are the prevertebral ganglia. They are known also as collateral or the pre-aortic ganglia. And these prevertebral ganglia lie between the sympathetic chain and the organ they supply. And the major prevertebral ganglia are the celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric ganglion, inferior mesenteric ganglion, and aorticorenal ganglion. Now let's look at the parasympathetic ganglia. These parasympathetic ganglia are the autonomic ganglia of the parasympathetic nervous system. Most are small terminal or intramural ganglia. Now, parasympathetics arising from the lateral horn of the spinal cord between S2 and S4, in other words, sacral parasympathetics. And the parasympathetics inside the vagus nerve synapse in terminal or intramural ganglia. Now, if a ganglia is found on the surface of the organ, it's called terminal ganglia. If a ganglion is located inside the wall of the organ, it is called intramural ganglia. Again, sacral parasympathetics, and the parasympathetics traveling with the vagus nerve synapse in the terminal and intramural ganglia, and but the parasympathetics traveling with the oculomotor nerve, facial nerve, and glossopharyngeal nerve synapse in named ganglia. Now, the pre-ganglionic parasympathetics traveling with the oculomotor nerve synapse in ciliary ganglion. And the post-ganglionics innervate the sphincter pupillae muscle and the ciliary muscle. Now, the pre-ganglionic parasympathetic fibers running with the facial nerve synapse in two different ganglia. One is the pterygopalatine ganglion, the other is the submandibular ganglion. And the preganglionic parasympathetics within the glossopharyngeal nerve synapse in otic ganglion.